On December 5, 1975, in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, a married couple was returning home from a school basketball game. On the way, a woman named Celeste decided to visit her niece who lived nearby. It was 8:30 p.m., so the girl was supposed to be home. The couple parked their car near the apartment complex. Celeste got out, leaving her husband to wait in the car. She only wanted to stop by for a moment to see her niece and make sure she was okay. But when she approached the apartment, she found the front door unlocked. Peering inside cautiously, Celeste saw a floor lamp knocked over, then noticed other overturned items. The entire state of the apartment suggested that a fight or some sort of scuffle had taken place. When the woman noticed strange stains on the floor that looked like blood, she overcame her anxiety and fear, which had paralyzed her limbs, and entered the living room. What she saw would haunt Celeste for the rest of her life. On the floor in the center of the room lay her beloved niece, Lindy, with a knife protruding from her throat. Naturally, the woman panicked. She immediately ran out of the house and rushed to her car. The police who arrived at the scene could not understand who could have had a problem with the young 19-year-old girl who had recently gotten married. Who could she have angered to be killed in such a brutal way? Who dared to enter her own home, her safest space, and commit a bloody massacre? Before we go any further, please support my channel. Put a like on the video and write in the comments from which city and state you are watching me. Thank you. Lindy Sue Beichler was born on January 31st, 1956. Her parents divorced when she was very young, and the girl was left in her mother's care. Her father moved to the suburbs and remarried. Later, he and his new wife had a son, Lindy's half-brother. From early childhood, Lindy was a curious, cheerful child. She wanted to try everything and often abandoned one activity to switch to something completely new. She was a member of the Girl Scouts, went hiking, rode boats, and attended various clubs. Lindy was a person who brought positivity to those around her. Her constant smile made others smile back. Lindy loved her family most of all. She enjoyed curling up on the couch under the soft hum of the TV, resting her head on her mother's lap. In those moments, she was the happiest person in the world, because her mother was not just a mom, but also her best friend. When the woman was later asked who might have wanted to harm her daughter, she racked her brain, but couldn't think of a single person who held a grudge against Lindy. Recently, the deceased girl had been working at a flower shop. Her boss and colleagues described Lindy as incredibly hardworking, modest, and somewhat shy. Upon closer acquaintance, Beichler seemed to blossom, cracking jokes and laughing heartily. She had a fantastic sense of humor and used it to the fullest. At the same time, she was a bit insecure, so she tried not to draw too much attention to herself. Despite all her insecurities, Lindy married at a fairly young age to a young man named Philip Beichler, who was 5 years her senior. They met when the girl was visiting her sister, and a neighbor stopped by. That neighbor was Philip Beichler. The young couple instantly liked each other. On October 19th, the year before the attack, Lindy and Philip got married. The officiant at the wedding was Beichler's grandfather. He blessed the marriage, saying that the two were simply made for each other. Philip worked part-time as an agent at a car rental company and was a student at Millersville State College, where he studied art. It seemed the young man was following in his parents' footsteps. His mother owned a gallery and was also passionate about art. Lindy, as mentioned, worked at a flower shop. She started there before the shop even existed. She even helped with the renovations of the premises before the flower shop opened. Initially, Lindy worked as a secretary, but later began arranging floral compositions. She loved her new role. In the end, Lindy worked there for only a couple of months. She managed to create her first Christmas wreath before she was brutally killed in her own apartment. The girl was just 2 months shy of her 20th birthday. She had only recently tasted adult life and was starting to get used to the role of a married woman. Philip and Lindy loved each other and were quite happy in their small one-bedroom apartment. But for some reason, the girl was afraid to stay home alone. She didn't feel safe. From the moment they moved in, Lindy constantly felt like someone was watching her through the sliding glass door. She didn't have anyone specific in mind. She was just scared to be alone in the apartment. The following month, in January, the young couple planned to move to another place. In the evenings, coming home from work a couple of hours earlier than her husband, Lindy would lock the doors and turn on all the lights. She listened to every little noise. Her loved ones said Beichler was afraid of her own shadow. But now, in light of what happened, it seemed as if she had a premonition of her impending death. During the crime scene investigation, the police discovered that the victim had been stabbed a total of 19 times. The attack was carried out with 2 different knives. One knife, the perpetrator apparently brought with them, as it was never found. The other knife was taken from Lindy's kitchen. It was this knife that was protruding from the girl's neck when her Aunt Celeste found her. The victim's body had 11 wounds to the chest and upper abdomen, 5 to the back, and 3 to the neck. One stab pierced the carotid artery, which ultimately led to her death from blood loss. Based on the defensive wounds on the victim's hands, experts concluded that Lindy fought back with all her strength and struggled for her life until the very end. The entire apartment was literally trashed, with blood everywhere. Likely, after finishing her shift at the flower shop, Lindy stopped for groceries, as the bags of food were still sitting on the kitchen table. She didn't even have time to unpack them, meaning the attack happened right after she returned home. Several pieces of evidence were found at the crime scene. A shoe print, approximately size 10 or 11, was left on the kitchen floor. Based on the assumption that the shoe print belonged to the attacker, it was likely a strong, sturdy man. The second piece of evidence related to a possible motive. Even though Lindy was fully clothed when found, detectives suspected she had been assaulted. Indeed, traces of seminal fluid were found on her underwear, from which the perpetrator's DNA could be extracted. However, in 1975, experts could only do a limited number of things with this evidence, such as determining the attacker's blood type and comparing it to a suspect's. But first, they needed to find a suspect. Unfortunately, that was where the evidence ended. The police didn't even have the perpetrator's fingerprints because the handle of the knife protruding from Lindy's throat was wrapped in a kitchen towel. The news of the girl's tragic death shocked her family. Lindy's parents were inconsolable. They had given their daughter away in marriage and were expecting grandchildren, not planning her funeral. Relatives called Philip at work and told him he needed to return home immediately because something had happened to Lindy. As the man rushed to the apartment, he imagined the worst scenarios. But he could never have imagined that his beloved wife had been brutally killed. The police didn't let Philip inside, and he couldn't understand what had happened. They kept him in the hallway until he finally heard that Lindy was dead. Seeing how pale the man became, medics gave him a sedative, and the police took him to his mother's house. For about 4 days, Philip was in a fog. He didn't know whether it was day or night or how much time had passed since the horrific tragedy. He had to sit and wait for answers that the police were trying to find. Investigators determined that Lindy had gone to work at the flower shop in a good mood. Detectives interviewed her colleagues and employer. None of them noticed anything unusual in the girl's behavior. Beichler didn't seem anxious or scared. That day, no dissatisfied customers or anyone else came into the shop. Everything was fine. It was a completely ordinary day. Lindy excitedly told her colleagues about the Christmas gift she had prepared for her husband. She was worried about whether the ceramic brush holder she had made with her own hands would please Phil. She also boasted that her husband would give her a puppy because she had always wanted a dog. This was why the couple planned to move to a larger apartment and set up an art studio there. In general, Lindy was preoccupied with everyday matters, and there was nothing remarkable about that day. In the evening, the girl calmly got into her car, waved to her colleagues, and drove toward home. No one knew that evening would be the last of her life. After work, around 5:30 p.m., Beichler headed to the car dealership where her husband, Philip, worked. That day, he received his paycheck. Lindy took the check, cashed it at the bank, and then went to a local grocery store where she bought groceries. All her purchases fit into 4 bags. Then the girl headed home. She parked the car in the parking lot and began unloading the groceries. Judging by the number of bags, she likely had to make 2 trips. Most likely, it was at that moment that someone entered her apartment and attacked her as soon as Lindy set the bags on the kitchen table. Detectives concluded this because there were no signs of a break-in, and Beichler was not the type of woman who would let a stranger into her home. This thought led the police to hypothesize that the girl knew the perpetrator and wasn't afraid to be alone with them. Naturally, the first suspect was the victim's husband. Although all relatives and friends insisted that Philip and Lindy were a happily loving couple, the detectives couldn't take their word for it. Philip loved Lindy deeply. He said that when they started dating, he couldn't believe his luck and was amazed that such a beautiful girl could be interested in him. The man claimed she changed his life for the better, inspired him to enroll in college, and encouraged him to pursue painting. In turn, he cherished and supported her dream of opening her own flower shop. Losing his wife was a devastating shock for Beichler. He could no longer stay in the apartment, where every little thing reminded him of Lindy, and eventually moved out. Despite Philip having a solid alibi, investigators were in no hurry to rule him out as a suspect. From that moment, the young man's life seemed to lose its direction. He wandered the streets aimlessly for hours, dropped out of college, and his confidence plummeted. He and Lindy had dreamed of finishing their studies and having children, making plans for the future. Now, in an instant, everything collapsed, like a sandcastle on the shore washed away by a wave. Everything they thought about, hoped for, and dreamed of vanished in a moment. Philip had to completely rebuild his life in light of the new reality. The second suspect was Lindy's direct supervisor, a man named Bob. His kind words and glowing reviews of the deceased girl backfired. The day before the tragedy, Lindy baked him blueberry muffins for his birthday. The boss spoke so fondly of his employee that the police wondered if Beichler was too appealing to him. Bob was 35, single, and had no alibi. Because of this, the police decided to take a closer look at him. The pressure from the authorities became so intense that Bob eventually hired a lawyer just to protect his right to privacy. He passed a lie detector test and fully cooperated with investigators. Bob had to work hard to convince detectives that he was not involved in Beichler's murder. After finally ruling out Lindy's husband and boss from the list of suspects, the police interviewed hundreds of people, including the girl's friends, family members, and acquaintances. But they found no one who might have wished her harm. Investigators questioned neighbors, but no one saw anything suspicious that day. The atmosphere in the apartment complex was tense. People were buying weapons to protect their lives. It was one thing when something terrible happened in another neighborhood, but it was entirely different when a young woman next door was killed by an unknown assailant. A note from the police was taped to the Beichlers' front door, stating that it was a crime scene and entry was prohibited. For the people living nearby, it was a constant reminder of the tragedy and the fact that the killer might still be nearby. The investigation stalled. The only lead from neighbors was about an unknown dark-colored car parked near Lindy's house at the time of her death. The car had its headlights on. Even if the driver wasn't involved in the crime, they could at least have been a witness. However, finding that car proved impossible. The neighbors' statements varied and no one remembered the license plate number. The phone at the police station was ringing off the hook. Some leads seemed promising, but none led to any real answers. So, investigators had to come up with their own theories. One theory the police worked on was that Lindy was being stalked by a stranger. He studied her schedule, her husband's schedule, and simply waited for the perfect time to strike. The perpetrator could have entered the apartment while the girl was retrieving groceries from the car, or perhaps it was a burglar planning to steal valuables from the home. He didn't expect the homeowner to return and, in a panic, attacked her with a knife. However, the burglary theory didn't hold up. Lindy's purse with her jewelry remained in the apartment. The sexual assault the victim endured also didn't fit the profile of a burglar. Finally, the police found a person of interest. It was an 18-year-old guy who was eventually arrested. His name was Mark, and he was a true monster. He already had 4 victims to his name. The guy attacked women, tied them up with their own clothes, and stabbed them with a screwdriver. When one of the victims tried to escape, he chased her in a car and tried to run her over. The area where this guy committed his crimes and the timing led the police to believe he was involved in the attack on Lindy. But after checking, it turned out he wasn't involved in the case because he was at work that day. Several of his colleagues confirmed this. He was eventually arrested for other horrific crimes. He tried to escape from prison and was shot. In March 1976, the police had another suspect when a 43-year-old woman named Mary Shing was stabbed to death in her own home in the same Lancaster County where Lindy lived. Mary worked as a secretary at a firm. She suffered from multiple sclerosis and had some coordination issues. On the day of the attack, colleagues drove her home and helped her get inside. In the evening, relatives stopped by, but no one answered the door. Her loved ones assumed Mary had gone to bed early and returned the next day. That's when the police discovered her lifeless body. Her death resulted from multiple stab wounds. Naturally, detectives linked the 2 attacks. There were many similarities, but there were also differences. Lindy was much younger and had no health issues. She was married while Mary was single. It took investigators just 2 weeks to arrest the person responsible for Shing's death. The culprit was a man named Kenneth Dale. Further investigation revealed that he had no connection to Lindy Beichler's murder. He was convicted only for the attack on Mary Shing. In December 1976, Lindy's entire family went to the cemetery to honor her memory. What the relatives saw made them turn pale. Someone had desecrated the girl's grave. The headstone was riddled with knife marks. Chunks of it lay nearby, and what remained of the gravestone was splattered with red spray paint. Initially, the police took this very seriously, assuming that whoever desecrated the grave might be responsible for Lindy's death. The vandal also used a knife, apparently knowing that Beichler had been stabbed. Only one grave in the entire cemetery was desecrated. The family hadn't publicized Lindy's burial site. This meant the perpetrator deliberately sought out its location and followed family members. Unfortunately, detectives couldn't identify the vandal. A month later, a letter addressed directly to the police chief arrived at the station. It was written in 2 different handwritings. The author of the letter confessed to desecrating Lindy's grave. He had struck the headstone just as the vandal had stabbed the girl's body a year earlier. Then, the person admitted to being addicted to illegal substances. He was the one who killed Lindy while high. The letter's author gave the police some clues to try to identify him. According to his confession, a few years earlier, he had lived in the West End suburb of Lancaster. He was a tall, heavy-set, and handsome man. He was capable of taking lives again without even realizing it. The author was well-educated and had a decent job, but loneliness drove him crazy. He had started using illegal drugs again and could commit another crime. He begged the police chief to catch him quickly because he was on the edge. The man set conditions. If his letter was published in Lancaster's Friday evening newspaper, he might confess. He would also need a priest to confess his sins. The next part was written in a different handwriting. The second person was a woman named Janice, as she introduced herself. She was the girlfriend of the man who took Lindy's life and urgently requested that her boyfriend's request about the newspaper publication be fulfilled. She added that further killings were not her boyfriend's intention. He was simply mentally ill. At that moment, her boyfriend was asleep, so Janice finished the letter for him and sent it to the recipient. At the end, the woman added that her boyfriend often visited the Manor shopping center in the evenings or walked around it. That's where the police tracked down the girl who called herself Janice. But she was very surprised that someone was using her name. She did live in Lancaster, but had no knowledge of any letter. Most likely, the letter was nothing more than a hoax. There are always individuals capable of amusing themselves with others' grief. That's how an entire year passed without answers. Lindy's family was left in ignorance and constant torment, not knowing what happened to the girl. Lindy's husband, Philip, was only able to speak relatively calmly about her death a year later and gave his first interview. The hardest thing for him was that his wife was killed in their own apartment, a place where she was supposed to be completely safe. Beichler was convinced that whoever the killer was, Lindy knew him. She would never have left the door unlocked, even if she went to the car for groceries, and she wouldn't have let a stranger into the apartment, even if Congress passed a law requiring it. Philip didn't blame the police for the lack of answers. He only remarked that early in the investigation, they spent a lot of effort on him. The authorities' official response to this interview was that the case was suspended due to a lack of real leads. If no additional information emerged soon, they would be forced to close it without getting to the bottom of it. Unfortunately, no information came. Years and decades passed before the police finally discovered who took the life of the innocent young woman. Over those years, detectives investigated hundreds of people somehow connected to Lindy's life. They checked the man her mother was dating, identified regular customers of the flower shop, and even tried to link the crime to known serial killers operating in Pennsylvania at the time. In a desperate attempt to get to the truth, detectives even turned to psychics. However, the case of Lindy Beichler's death remained unsolved. At one point, investigators considered the possibility that the girl might have been a victim of the Zodiac. The Zodiac was a serial killer who terrorized Northern California from the late 1960s to the early 1970s. By his own claims, the Zodiac had 37 victims. The reason the notorious criminal was linked to the Beichler case was that after one of his attacks, the Zodiac sent a series of taunting letters to local newspapers. Detectives explored parallels between those letters and the message from the stranger who reported the killing of Lindy. Ultimately, the police contacted California authorities handling the Zodiac case and reached out to the FBI so a handwriting expert could create a profile of the perpetrator. According to the expert, the letter was indeed written by one person who simply altered the slant of the writing. The author had clear issues with anger and lost complete control over their life after committing the crime, assuming they were the one who stabbed Lindy. The suspect was obsessively devoted to either their job, family, or religion. The purpose of the letter was to distract the police from the investigation. The FBI expert also noted that the letter's author was left-handed and likely struggled with their sexual identity. It was possible that they were actually a woman, as few men would describe themselves as handsome. Experts weren't certain this person committed the murder, but they could have been a witness or even the orchestrator of the bloody crime. To great disappointment, identifying the letter's author at that time was impossible, as the letter was never published, and all information about it was kept confidential. 25 years after Lindy's tragic death, the lead detective retired. The Beichler case became one of the oldest unsolved cases in Lancaster County. In 2006, the investigation into Lindy's death was handed over to a special society in Pennsylvania that studied old unsolved cases with fresh perspectives and new technologies. Even they couldn't make progress. Meanwhile, Mike, Lindy's half-brother, met a man named Vince. They were united by the same problem. Vince had a sister, Christy Marak, who was killed by an unknown perpetrator in 1992. Like Lindy's case, there was no progress in Christy's case. The investigation had also hit a dead end. The men who lost their sisters in the same county joined forces and placed photos of the two victims on a large billboard with the words, "You know who took our lives." It was a good way to keep the girls' names and information about them in the public eye, as the advertisement drew media attention and the cases were back in the spotlight. It took a long time before Christy Marak's death was solved using a preserved DNA sample found at the crime scene. Through a very labor-intensive process, detectives were able to identify the perpetrator through relatives, arrest him, and convict him. It turned out to be a local DJ who worked near the young woman's apartment. Decades after his wife's death, Philip Beichler learned about the DNA analysis methods used to convict the perpetrator in Christy Marak's case and decided the same could be applied to Lindy's case. However, the evidence had been stored for decades, and its condition left much to be desired. In 2019, the police used the method to analyze DNA from the Beichler crime scene and created a composite sketch of the potential perpetrator. Based on the DNA, a computer program generated two portraits. One showed what the person likely looked like at the time of the attack on Lindy, and the other depicted them at age 65. It wasn't an exact replica of the perpetrator, but provided insight into their hair color, skin tone, eye shape, and possible distinctive features. Investigators could now confidently say the person had fair skin, brown eyes, and dark hair. Finding them was still a challenge. The DNA sample was sent to a prominent American genetic genealogist, C.C. Moore. She determined that the person whose DNA was left on the victim's underwear in 1975 had origins tied to a small town in Italy. Then, through an enormous amount of work, Moore identified the number of people with Italian genetic connections living in Lancaster County at the time Lindy was killed. In fact, C.C. Moore had to study the migration patterns of people from a small town in southern Italy to Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. She ruled out over 2,000 people with similar genetic information and, using public records, narrowed the suspect pool to a single person, finally giving the police the name of the likely perpetrator who took Lindy's life. It was a man named David Sinopoli. Checking this name against existing databases, investigators found nothing. This man had never previously come to the police's attention, and his name wasn't on any suspect lists. But when detectives reviewed the case files, they discovered that David Sinopoli lived in the same apartment complex as the Beichlers. To confirm his involvement in Lindy's death, they needed David's DNA. On February 11, 2022, the 68-year-old man, his wife, and another couple were at Philadelphia International Airport, waiting for their flight. To pass the time, they got coffee and enjoyed the drinks while chatting about the upcoming trip. All the while, police were watching them from a distance. The methods the detectives used to catch the perpetrator were reminiscent of a scene from a crime drama. When the man finished his coffee and threw the empty cup in the trash, an officer discreetly approached the bin, retrieved the used disposable cup, and carefully placed it in a plastic bag. The cup was sent to a lab to extract a DNA sample. Experts were able to match the DNA from the coffee cup to the seminal fluid found on Lindy's underwear. This confirmed that Sinopoli was at the crime scene. Additionally, 2 drops of blood found on her stockings also matched Sinopoli's DNA. There was a large amount of blood at the crime scene. Investigators assumed it belonged to the victim, but they considered the possibility that the perpetrator might have cut himself and left traces behind. In July 2022, around 7 a.m., the police knocked on David Sinopoli's door, located a few miles from where Lindy was killed years earlier. He offered no resistance during the arrest, but his wife, with whom he had lived for 36 years, was completely bewildered. They had 3 children and 9 grandchildren. None of them had any idea they had been living with a criminal and murderer all this time. After the murder of the innocent 19-year-old Lindy Beichler, this man lived peacefully for nearly 47 years. He never told anyone what he had done and was certain he would remain unpunished. After Sinopoli's arrest, Lindy's family could seemingly celebrate this event. However, many family members didn't live to see justice served. Lindy's father passed away in 2000, followed by her mother in 2007. Her husband, Philip Beichler, was still alive. He had remarried around 1990, though initially he hadn't planned to. He said he wanted to live up to Lindy's expectations for him, finish college, attend graduate school, and become an artist, which he did. Philip didn't want to start new, serious relationships for a long time, but he realized it would lead to a lonely existence. At some point, he shed the burden of the tragedy and was finally able to move forward. The day after David Sinopoli's arrest, the police department held a press conference and announced to the public that the case of Lindy Sue Beichler's murder could be considered closed. People who knew and loved David believed there was some mix-up and refused to believe in his involvement until the end. About 18 years earlier, Sinopoli had received probation after being caught peeping at a naked woman in a beauty salon run by his wife. Sinopoli was the only employee there and had been watching a client while she was tanning in a solarium. He had no criminal record, and colleagues described him as a perfectly ordinary person. In reality, this man evaded punishment for his crime for nearly half a century. It's bitter and painful to realize that after taking a young woman's future, he continued to live as if nothing had happened. Years passed, but the police never forgot about this case and never stopped trying to solve it. And in the end, justice caught up with the villain. David Sinopoli was held in custody without bail. At first, he categorically denied any involvement in Beichler's death. But as the trial approached, he changed his stance and accepted a plea deal. On October 19, 2023, 48 years after the crime, David Sinopoli pleaded guilty to third-degree murder, aggravated assault, and burglary. He was sentenced to 25 to 50 years in prison. The judge stated in his remarks that given the defendant's age, this was essentially a life sentence. Sinopoli never discussed with anyone the reasons why he took the life of a young woman, brutally stabbing her 19 times and then violating her body only to satisfy his own selfish desires. Lindy and David lived in the same apartment complex and were neighbors. There is no evidence that they ever interacted before, so the true motives of the crime remain an unsolved mystery, even for the police. Perhaps the girl appealed to him greatly, and at some point David couldn't restrain his secret desires. Animal instinct prevailed, which is why David is now behind bars. If you have finished watching, you are a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell notifications, and put the like. See you in the next video.